participants in the room. Should we just give it one more minute? I can see the room is filling up. Great. Good. So let's get started. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Jodie Keane. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at ODI Global, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here today to our webinar on bridging climate and trade policy, where we'll be reflecting on Africa's journey from the African Climate Summit 2 that was held earlier on this year, looking at COP30 and the ongoing discussions, but we've also got our eye on MC14 as well. So this webinar is organised in partnership with the Trade Negotiations Investment Forum Nairobi, and I'll pass shortly to Excellency Ambassador Amina Mohammed shortly for her keynote address and welcome. Before doing so, let me welcome you all and all of our esteemed panelists. I know some of you are joining us from COP, so we're really grateful. We know that this COP must deliver and focus on the implementation agenda, so that includes finance, technology, but also the capacity to turn ambition into reality. This includes mitigation, but also adaptation. And this is the message that came out very loud and clear from the second African Climate Summit. And we know that it's also the message of the COP presidency as well. So we hope to make these links and then to, as I say, keep our eye on MC14 and the issues that may be followed through in the multilateral trade arena. So before we get further into this discussion, let me now warmly welcome and invite Excellency Ambassador Amina Mohammed to provide her welcome and scene-setting remarks. Ambassador, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jodie Keane. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. It's a privilege to join you here today. This is an extremely important forum as we move ahead, and I think Jodie has told us why it's critically important to be meeting exactly now. So let me start by extending my sincere gratitude to ODI Global, our co-conveners, for partnering with us, including on issues that sit at the very nexus of our collective future, the intersection of trade, climate, and sustainable development. I appreciate all the panelists that are joining us today. It's our pleasure to share in this dialogue with you and to learn from your experience and your expertise. Let me begin by talking just a little about the Trade Negotiations and Investment Forum. It's a pioneering think tank dedicated to advancing the continued relevance and effectiveness of the multilateral trading system and regional trade initiatives, with a particular focus on priorities and constraints of developing and LDC countries. I should also mention that this collaboration with ODI Global is not our first. It reflects a shared commitment that we have to confronting the sustainability and trade agenda head-on, including the identification and realization of Africa's green trade opportunities. As we are all aware, COP30 is currently actually in session. This is happening in Brazil, and we are wishing them all the best, of course. But we all know that it's a defining moment for global climate action, as it's expected to unveil new and more ambitious proposals to address persistent multilateral challenges. Challenges that include how trade and climate regimes interact through carbon pricing and border carbon adjustment mechanisms. For African economies, the real test is ensuring that these measures support rather than impede or undermine regional integration and green industrialization efforts. We recall that in September this year, the second African Climate Summit, already referred to by Jodie, was held in Addis Ababa, and it reaffirmed Africa's commitment to ambitious climate action, which is anchored in our realities: just transition, climate finance, adaptation, and resilience, as well as low carbon growth. These priorities will shape Africa's engagement at the current COP and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, it's for this precise reason that this session comes at a critical juncture. The climate crisis is no longer a distant threat. It's a present reality, reshaping economies, disrupting supply chains, and testing the resilience of nations. And while COP30 will set the tone for the next phase of international climate governance, the 14th WTO Ministerial Conference that is scheduled to take place in Africa, in Yaoundé, in March of 2026, will be the next major moment on the multilateral calendar, where the outcomes of BELAM will inevitably influence negotiations on trade rules that must now align with our climate objectives. This urgency is the very drumbeat of our time. For many, especially in Africa, this is not a future scenario. It's a lived reality of drought-stricken farmlands, climate-displaced communities, and immense pressure on economies that did the least to cause the current crisis. Therefore, the conversation we're starting today is not merely academic. It's urgent and it's essential. At the core of this discussion, I'm almost certain that we all recognize a fundamental truth. Trade is not peripheral to the climate fight. It's central. And so why does trade matter for climate now? Well, trade rules shape the global flows of the very goods that will power the green transition. These rules govern the exchange of clean technologies, the distribution of critical minerals, and the resilience of our food systems. The question that remains is, who bears the adjustment costs? Who captures the value? And how can small, vulnerable economies participate? A lot is changing in the world of trade and environment. And I'll begin by the policy landscape that's being radically reshaped. We're witnessing a rapid expansion of climate-aligned industrial policies, from massive investments in clean tech and critical minerals to the modernization of national grids. The global race in battery technology and EV supply chains, for example, is not just about building a single factory. It's also about creating entire ecosystems where a single policy can trigger a wave of investments in new EV and battery plants across a single country. Concurrently, we see the growth of product-specific sustainability rules. For example, the EU deforestation regulation, which presents a shift from the verification of a product to policing the production process across a supply chain. Friends, these are no longer niche standards. They are becoming market gatekeepers, which redefine competitiveness. We have moved from voluntary eco-labels to mandatory and legally enforceable regulations, which determine whether a product can even enter a market. This is just one demonstration. Soon, the carbon intensity of a good, of a product, may be as important as its price and quality in procurement decisions and consumer choices that will be made across the world. Furthermore, the emergence of measures like the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, and the rise of carbon clubs signal a fundamental shift towards pricing carbon into international trade, creating a new layer of regulatory complexity. Let me say something about institutional cooperation, which is evolving in response to all these developments. And here the ACFTA provides a powerful illustration of how deeper regional integration is proactively shaping a sustainable future. Work is advancing on the ACFTA Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade, deliberately ensuring the green economy is inclusive ab initio. Furthermore, there's active and strategic work ongoing, what we might call the development of ACFTA Green Rules of Origin, focused on designing our origin criteria to actively promote regional value chains in sustainable sectors. This includes solar energy and battery assembly. To this point, we can think of an example of ongoing discussions in the context of the AU, calling for leveraging trade for a green and sustainable recovery, an extremely important discussion. These initiatives are welcome because they create the political mandate, the political will necessary for innovative ideas, such as the African Green Stimulus Program, which is not passive at all. And this is not passive integration. It's a conscious effort to use our trade rules to ensure Africa participates as a producer and as an innovator, and not just as a consumer in the green global economy. I would also mention that the increase in plurilateral initiatives on green goods, standards, and supply chain demonstrates a move away from a one-size-fits-all approach. There are several examples to think about here. The Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability is one of those. Such arrangements which respond to specific trade and climate concerns are encouraged and welcome. However, while we champion this plurilateral innovation, we must be equally clear that it complements rather than replaces our multilateral imperatives. Certain challenges, by their very nature, demand universal global participation. The WTO fisheries subsidies negotiations are a prime example. Finalizing a comprehensive agreement to curb harmful subsidies that drive overfishing is a quintessential global public good. There is now heightened and quite justifiable attention on the distributional impacts of the shifts that I've just highlighted. We're now acutely aware of the risks for MSMEs, LDC members, and small vulnerable economies. From the erosion of trade preferences as economies decarbonize, to the high cost of complying with new due diligence expectations on supply chains. The conversation is no longer only about environmental efficiency. It's also, and importantly so, about who benefits and who is left behind. I must emphasize that all our solutions should be designed with equity at their core. The question then becomes, where are the core capital and technical opportunities, and which challenges must we together overcome? As we map this new territory, we must recognize a fundamental truth. Opportunity and challenge are two sides of the same coin. The vast promise of the green transition is inseparably linked to stark pitfalls that we must overcome. Let me begin with the opportunities which are present, and they're multiple. First, we can achieve immediate impact by focusing on interoperable standards and conformity assessment. Promoting mutual recognition agreements would dramatically cut compliance costs, especially for our MSMEs, and accelerate the diffusion of green technologies. Secondly, we can save lives and livelihoods by leveraging trade facilitation for adaptation goods. This is where trade rules can have the most immediate impact. Climate change is causing a present-day crisis. Crops are failing now. Floods are displacing our communities, and heat waves are claiming more and more lives. Ladies and gentlemen, adaptation is no longer about long-term planning. It's about urgent response. We must therefore treat adaptation goods with the same priority and urgency that we afford medical supplies during a pandemic. Expedited customs clearance and applying zero or low tariffs to essential goods are only a few examples which represent a direct investment in resilience. Lastly, I will address critical minerals with shared value. Trade and investment rules, we should do more than extract raw materials. They must catalyze responsible investment, diversify processing, and ensure tangible local benefit sharing. And so what are the challenges that we must manage? One is the risk of fragmentation. The very plurilateral and or bilateral initiatives we welcome can well become exclusionary. We risk a fractured global economy of conflicting standards. The antidote is not to halt these initiatives. Rather, is to consciously build inclusivity into their DNA right from the start. The second challenge we face is subsidy races and trade tensions. As we may all be aware, by now, well-intentioned policies can escalate into harmful subsidy races if they lack transparency and with no notification. We have witnessed how local content requirements can create new conflicts and further the global scramble to dominate the industries of the future. Green subsidies must therefore be managed wisely, and this primarily requires enhanced transparency and notification at the WTO. Let us encourage green subsidy peer reviews so that we promote best practices and ensure our collective ambition accelerates and does not fracture the global transition. Now to the last issue that I must address. What should we prioritize and how are we to move forward? This is our call to ensure that this is a truly just transition. Our priorities should be focused on areas where cooperation yields the highest impact for both climate and development. And I have only 3 points here. First, we must champion transparent development-compatible measures which pay due regard to the core principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Second, we must build interoperability and trust by driving mutual recognition agreement on conformity assessment and harmonizing carbon accounting methodologies. And third, we must elevate the adaptation agenda from rhetoric to reality. Climate justice demands that we treat adaptation, and Jody referred to this, with the same urgency as mitigation. Ladies and gentlemen, as we turn to our discussions, let me conclude with the following. The choices we make at this moment on how we align trade with climate ambition, how we distribute burdens and share opportunities, how we protect the vulnerable while enabling transformation, will define the integrity and the legitimacy of the global economic system that we pass on. These choices must be informed, they must be inclusive, and they must be deliberate. And having said that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. It's now my pleasure to invite our moderator and co-convener, Dr. Jody Keane, to guide us through what I am certain will be a rich, challenging, and solutions-oriented conversation with our distinguished panelists, who I appreciate very much for turning up today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I'm sure we're going to explore these final reflections further, the need for a just transition and for a focus on where cooperation can yield the greatest climate and development-related gains, where we can foster interoperability and more fundamentally really raise this adaptation agenda from rhetoric to reality. So let me now turn to our esteemed panel, and I'll begin with Carolyn, if that's okay. Carolyn, you and your team have been deeply involved with the kind of trade climate nexus, not only at this COP, but at previous COPs and so on. So can you share with us some of your insights regarding the institutional and governance-related innovations that are emerging from this COP and their implications for tackling these challenging issues at the nexus of climate and trade?
Thank you very much, Jody, for the introduction, and really a great honor to follow you, Amina Mohammed, and your excellent opening remarks. So thank you. I really look forward to learning a lot from others in this discussion today as well. So just briefly, just to begin, for those who are not familiar with TESS, I think it's useful to sit back a little bit where we approach, how we come into these discussions. So we're based in Geneva, where most of our work is on the multilateral trading system and also on the COP process as well. But our mission is very much to foster inclusive international cooperation. and action on trade and sustainability. So that means we're really striving for a global trading system that responds to urgent environmental crises like the climate crisis, but does so in ways that is responsive to and addresses the urgent sort of development, long-standing development priorities of developing countries as well. So we have the opportunity to interact on a daily basis with a range of delegations to the WTO, including a range of African countries represented here in Geneva, and also to work with a range of stakeholders and experts around the world. So today our team are on the way to, or my team are on the way to COP30, where we will be engaged in a number of different discussions around climate and trade. And also we will continue to be actively involved in the preparations for MC14, which will be held in Cameroon next March. Also on the nexus, our work is focused there on the nexus of trade, climate, and sustainable development. So if I may, Jody, I'm just going to step back quickly on the way in which we see some of what we are hearing from African countries about their priorities in the multilateral setting on these issues, and then turn at the end towards this issue of innovations in the UNFCCC context. So just first, very briefly, from what we hear from delegations here, a core priority for them, there's a lot of debate and tension around climate and trade. But from many delegates and also from ambassadors, what we hear is a desire to understand what the pathways forward are for them. How can they harness trade and shape trade cooperation in ways that will serve their interest in a climate resilient, low carbon development for Africa in a way that's consistent with concerns around climate justice and so on. But my sense is the drive is less to be focused on the many injustices at hand, but work out how do they navigate those and get what the region needs and has been asking for and working towards in terms of opportunities and so on. So that shapes a bit how I see this going forward. So what we hear from African countries here is that they face a triple crisis in relation to climate and trade. And I think Ambassador Mohammed alluded to some of these. So the first is they face this immediate challenge of adapting to and responding to the impacts of the climate crisis on their trade infrastructure, their ability to produce, trade, and build resilience. This is particularly important for sectors like agriculture and fisheries, for food security, and so on. At the same time, they're faced with the challenges of responding to and adjusting to this growing range of trade-related climate measures applied by third countries. So you're all aware here of the frustration and concerns about injustice of some of those measures because they place a disproportionate economic burden on African countries, despite their minor contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, African countries have express an enduring interest in economic transformation and diversification and in being competitive also in this green economy and in this decarbonizing global economy. So I think their position is both to express high concern about the trends and the way in which these measures are being designed and implemented and so on, but at the same time recognizing the importance of the trading system responding to the climate crisis, recognizing the need for the largest economies to take action. This is what we've all been calling for, is for them to take action on the climate crisis. But to think much harder about how they can do so in a way that generates economic opportunities and prosperity and partnerships also with African countries, and that supports their regional efforts, as has been alluded to drive forward economic diversification, industrialization, and so on. But so these sort of three things are happening at the same time, and in the context of limited fiscal space, high debt burdens, limited access to private investment, failure for financing to be delivered, challenges related to access to technology at affordable prices that's adapted to local circumstances and so on. So my first message from today in that context of that triple challenge is the importance for the Africa region having a stronger role in the framing of the climate and trade discussion. So in the first instance, what I hear is the need to always talk about it as a climate, trade, and sustainable development discussion. It's always in the context of their development priorities or sustainable development priorities. The second thing is, whilst the climate agenda focuses a lot on decarbonisation, with good reason, because that's very urgent, we need to look at all three aspects of the climate agenda. So the decarbonisation side, the adaptation side, and also the sort of resilience and responding to losses and recurring damage as well. These are all things that impact the trading prospects of countries and their competitiveness and their efforts to diversify. So I'm sure others here will talk more about the decarbonisation side, but just to emphasize that I think for many countries, they recognize that to be competitive, they will need to be engaged in a decarbonisation effort nationally and regionally, even if one can debate their level of responsibilities under the climate regime, that just as an economic reality, this is something that they will need to find ways to navigate. Whether that's in terms of energy systems or heavy industry or even, use of tropical forests and so on. We've heard about the concern about the measures that are being undertaken and the need for these to be designed in ways that that better reflect and address their concerns. So moving on from decarbonisation on adaptation, what we hear is the critical importance of the agriculture sector and food system. And this is something we don't hear enough about in the climate and trade discussion. It tends to be very much focused on industrial sectors. When I speak to ambassadors here in Geneva, a top priority is food insecurity, hunger, rural livelihoods, devastation of agricultural production and yields and so on. So this is something that's of major concern, both because trade will need to play a role in helping them to address food insecurity issues, but also because they will need to think about reorganizing trade, sometimes regionally, sub-regionally, and will also need to have support from the trading system in things ranging from adaptation technologies to thinking about different ways of organizing resilient regional supply chains and infrastructure and so on. So this adaptation side is really key for them. And then the sort of third element of this sort of wider climate and trade discussion is grounding all of this in the focus on economic diversification and development. And here we hear a lot about the importance of looking for ways for the African region to capitalize on this extraordinary natural resource base that you have in the region. I'm sure others here will talk more about critical minerals and the opportunities there. The one reflection I would have there is that we don't discuss the issues of critical minerals very much in the multilateral trade context. And I think it will be useful to think about how best constructively to do so and with what sort of goals. So there's links to discussions around green industrial policy. There's work that could potentially be done to provide some guidance to governments on how best they might approach these kinds of access and partnership deals around critical minerals. I'm sure there'll be others here with more to say on that, but just to note, it hasn't been very prominent in discussions, at least in the multilateral trading system. So just now turning back to sort of more of the COP angle or the COP and WTO angle, a challenge to date has been this big disconnect between the climate and trade regime around climate and trade issues. So you have what it means is that some of the things that are self-evident to talk about in the climate context, like the 3 pillars of the regime, the importance of climate resilient development and so on, these are all newer concepts in the trade arena where the climate and trade discussion has much more been led by concerns around particular measures, with good reason, but it's been focused on BCAs, on climate standards and so on. So to me, part of our challenge is to reframe a bit what are some of the core issues that require attention from a developing country viewpoint. I think a core thing here is to highlight more where African countries are already being path breakers. For example, Kenya, Morocco. We don't hear enough about the excellent work that's being done within the region already that's relevant to the climate and trade discussion. Tess serves as a secretariat for the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate, And we're, very proud that there are 9 African countries in that coalition: Angola, Cabo Verde, Cameroon, Gambia, Kenya, Morocco, Mozambique, Rwanda, and Zambia. And what's great about that is that those ministers then become part of a conversation about what international cooperation should look like on trade and climate, what it could look like going forward. And I think we really need to find more spaces where African leadership is engaged in trying to set the frame and agenda for some of these climate and trade discussions. Part of that will require, and this link between the climate and trade regimes will require stronger coordination and coherence at the national level on climate, trade, and development issues. Very few countries have a sort of joined up approach to thinking about the nexus between those 3 areas, and that applies in developed countries as well. It's not a developing country issue or an African country issue. In general, we need to think harder about the role of trade policies and strategies in the context of climate and development issues. I would say to date, there have been some excellent submissions from African countries and from the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific group in Geneva around issues of trade and climate, but there's not a very concerted and consistent leadership voice. These are in the Geneva context, these delegations are very constrained in terms of time and resources. So it's something that would warrant perhaps, a more concerted effort in making clear what the sort of strategic priorities are and forward-looking priorities around positive incentives or opportunities they want to harness and so on. Just in the lead up to MC14, and then I'll close, there are opportunities to be discussing how sustainability issues fit more broadly into the WTO reform agenda. Obviously, for many African countries, the development issues will be those that are most important. But I think we see from the discussion today that those development issues are closely interlinked with sustainability issues going forward. So if we can find a way of how to talk about that more effectively. There is a discussion underway in the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment on producing a technical outcome in advance of MC14 that would aim to provide some guidance around aspects of trade-related climate measures and to bolster cooperation. We could come back to that in the discussion, but I think there's a broad recognition of the need to have more focused dialogue, more solution-oriented discussions that would generate practical outcomes and guidance that countries can use. And in this regard, going right back to your initial thing around the COP30, Brazil will be launching on Friday, I think this week, Saturday morning, its proposal for a new integrated forum on climate and trade, which will be aiming explicitly to draw together expertise from the climate community and the trade community within governments to try and bridge some of these gaps, build some more trust around issues of climate and trade, identify where are some concrete areas where there could be productive dialogue and potentially solutions that would help to offer a bit more light and hopefully progress on this climate and trade nexus. But thank you, Jody. I only got to your question towards the end, but I felt I needed the arc to get there.
Yeah, I think it was incredibly helpful for us all to have the arc, Carolyn. So thank you very much indeed for your intervention. So I'd like to turn to Michael Jacobs, and of course, please put your any questions that you have in the chat box, and we can pick up on your questions shortly. But I'd now like to turn to you, Michael, and you're joining us from COP. So can you share with us any more information on some of the main tensions between the climate and trade agendas at COP and how these have been resolved, they are being resolved, what's outstanding, and anything you can share on kind of African perspectives on the issues would be extremely helpful as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Jody and everybody. I hope you can hear me. As you can see, I'm actually in the rainforest. I'm actually in the DRC pavilion where there is a convenient table to sit at. I wish I could say the trade and climate issues have been resolved at COP. They are, however, on the agenda, and that is a new thing for COP. The Brazilians were very keen that trade and climate issues were on the agenda for this COP. A number of other developing countries have also said they need to be discussed, and we're still working out here exactly how to do that. There isn't a formal agenda item on this at this COP. There hasn't been before, but over the last couple of days, we've had a number of consultations between parties brokered by the presidency, Brazil, on how that discussion should be held. Unsurprisingly, the focus of the developing countries, including African countries here, is on the CBAM, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which they see understandably as a potential threat to their exports into the EU. Brazil is also, as we know, very concerned about the due diligence directive of the EU, which, although it's now been postponed a little bit, in principle tells European-based multinationals that they can only source materials, particularly from forest nations that have been sustainably sourced according to EU auditing methods. Both the CBAM and the due diligence directive are seen as restrictions on trade, effectively environmental protectionism. They come from two different places. I think it's quite important to say this, that the CBAM is a mechanism designed by the EU to protect its own industrial companies that are subjected to quite a high now carbon price within the EU from competition from countries just outside the EU, mainly. That's the main concern, who could export into the EU without facing that carbon price because they're not located within the EU. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is intended to equalize the carbon price paid by all companies that might be selling into the EU. That's quite different from the due diligence directive, which is simply about applying European standards of sustainable behavior, what Europeans think they have standards, to imports into the EU. Understandably, that riles Brazil no end, since Brazil says we are managing our forests ourselves. Thank you very much. We will determine the standards that govern the export of timber and other produce from rainforest areas. So these things are on the agenda here, or rather, we are trying to find a place for them on the agenda, but they will be discussed. And I think that's a big step forward for the COP regime. The European Union made a kind of generous offer yesterday in the consultations on this, generous by the EU standards, let me say, which is to have a discussion about all of those issues, including the CBAM and the due diligence directive, as long as they are not the only people who are thought to have trade restrictions. They pointed out that there are many fossil fuel subsidies around the world, which are forms of trade restriction, and many countries are now imposing, or already have, regulatory systems for domestic sales of electrical products, of agricultural products, and so on, which, when put in competition with imports, become restrictions on trade. And of course, the EU has many of these. Famously, the EU will not import chicken from America because in America, chickens can be chlorinated. And in Europe and the UK, we think that's a bad thing. So these regulatory trade restrictions are also, the Europeans say, part of this agenda. And they said, rightly in my view, that we should be looking to harmonize regulations where possible. And the obvious solution, obvious at a theoretical level, if not perhaps quite so simple in practice, for the Brazil-EU dispute, is for the Brazilians to say what their sustainable forest regulatory methods and standards are, and for Europe to say we regard those as equivalent. We already have a system of equivalence in regulatory regimes. That's how Brexit managed to survive, because we've said that some of the British regulations, now that we've left the EU, are equivalent to European ones, and that gives us a method of trading. And one would hope that Brazil and the EU could come to some kind of equivalence arrangement. This may be easier said than done, but I think it's a principle. The other crucial thing, which I think is very important for African countries, is on critical minerals and green manufacturing. Most African countries are looking to try and step up their green manufacturing, particularly further up the value chain, in order to access now what are hugely growing markets in Europe and in the industrialized world, and indeed in other parts of the developing world, in response to the demands of the green transition. African countries, some of them, have real potential in green manufacturing, and they worry about CBAMs effectively penalizing them for that. many African countries, including the DRC, whose pavilion I'm in now, have critical minerals which are desperately needed by countries around the world for the clean transition, but have really struggled to export them, and in particular to get the export to get more of the added value. Most of the world's critical minerals go to China, and the added value of refining and selling those minerals goes to China, not to their original producer countries. And given that European countries in particular, but almost all developed countries, this is also true of Japan, Korea, obviously the US, are rather desperate to diversify their sources of critical minerals. They are not very comfortable about the huge share of the market that China has. There does seem, again, in principle, to be an opportunity for African countries and developed countries, Europe, Japan, Korea, to come to trade arrangements with African countries to invest in critical mineral production and refinement, with the guarantee that these will be sold into northern manufacturers of green technologies. Frankly, if you had a 25-year offtake agreement, you could probably finance that without any additional subsidy from developed country governments. But this seems to me to be the right agenda approach, where we say, yes, if we only have restrictions, then that is a problem, but let's turn the threat of restrictions into an opportunity to sell low carbon, green technologies and products into European and developed country markets where there is a clear need for them for our own green technology transitions, and where we need supply. And if that supply can be diversified from its current sources, we would see that as a win-win. So that, I think, is the agenda. I don't think much, I think much of that, I think most of that will be done at very rhetorical levels at the COP, because this is not a trade environment. The negotiators here are not trade experts. But I think if we can get to some kind of understanding about that in principle, we can then transfer some of that to the trade regimes and to the bilateral and plurilateral regimes of cooperation, particularly between the EU and African countries.
Fabulous, Michael. So as you were talking, of course, in my mind is kind of the African green industrialization, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and so on. So we'll pick up on some of the points that you mentioned there in the Q&A, but I'd now like to turn to Kennedy, if that's okay, if you're online, Kennedy, to talk to you and ask you for your thoughts and your reflections on how Africa, but also other parts of the world, can better manage the kind of ongoing energy transition risks, and perhaps your views and your reflections on in terms of what are the implications for the international trade regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody, and thanks for the invitation to join this stellar panel and discussion on a very timely topic. So I'll add to the discussion by maybe adding a few issues that I think speak to the broader themes that have been raised. I'd like to talk about two things. First, the aspect of energy transition risks, because we've talked a lot about opportunities, but less about risks. But the issue of risks is very important when we think about just transition and energy being at the center of it. But I'd also like to reflect in closing on the opportunities that might be presented by what we see as challenges. So I think energy transition, of course, is very key or core to just transition. And for African countries, that is clearly acknowledged. If you look at many of the NDCs of African countries, they include the energy component. And of course, argument has been African countries have energy as an important sector or opportunity for one, expanding access to energy, but also making sure that the energy is clean and renewable. But that also raises quite a number of questions. The first one is framing. Do we frame the issue of transition risks when you talk about just transition? If you read many of the NDCs of African countries, as with many of the issues of, NDCs of developing countries, you see the way they framed kind of gives an indication of how they think about climate change. Almost all African NDCs are framed, like we make commitments, climate commitments in this NDC, but in the context of sustainable development. That's not an accident. It's a very important point that African countries have advanced since the beginning of the climate negotiations. I think that has implications when you think about just transition and the issue of making sure, for example, countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels can manage the risks. I'll give an example. One is the issue of leaving fossil fuels in the ground. That debate has been going on mostly as kind of policy or scholarly debates, but we've seen quite practical examples that show how that could be done. And the association of the African Petrol Producers Organization, which is a treaty-based organization of mainly low-income African countries, went to the African Development Bank and the African Export-Import Bank, and they asked them, what trade tools do you have that can help us to transition? And they've established the Africa Energy Transition Bank as an institution that will help them to manage that transition, being aware that they need to do the transition, but manage it in a way that addresses risks, but looking at institutions that have the expertise and the tools that can help them to manage. I think that's a concrete example of an institution that, even though one might say it's riddled with contradictions because the institution still has a mandate to expand energy, broadly understood, including from fossil fuels, but kind of putting that question or that issue at the center of the kind of new institutions that we're designing is absolutely critical if we are to chip away at those problems. So I think for me, that is an issue that has to be put at the center, and asking how trade policy would help. That's a clear example of a very practical way that trade policy could help countries in energy transition. I think the other aspect which I could draw from the African case is the issue of institutional innovation. Of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has been mentioned as an example of a very kind of innovative approach of regional trade. But I think there are more lessons and even deeper lessons that can be learned there and maybe considered elsewhere in terms of how to connect trade and climate. Much of the discussion has been at the multilateral trading system, where we ask, what can the multilateral climate regime do to accommodate trade, which is an important question, or vice versa, how can the trade regime accommodate climate aspects? But I think what is forgotten as well is how that is happening in practice. If you look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, it's based on countries developing national implementation strategies. If you look at some of the strategies, they already include climate aspects, and the guidelines developed by the UNECA, for example, to help countries in designing the strategies, include the guidance on incorporating maybe NDCs or other aspects of green industrial policy that speak to the climate question. I think that is very important because these kinds of bottom-up approach ensure the context of the countries are put at the center of the analysis, and then the tools that can be helpful in connecting trade and climate then can be used in a way that speaks to the actual context of these countries. Of course, there's the issue of coordination. How do you coordinate that across the continent? That's another issue, but I think that's a better way of thinking about it, like bottom-up approaches, but then thinking of what is common, what is different, and then coordinating that. And what is common being kind of a more coordinated at the continental level. I think other regions could learn that and think of bottom-up approaches of connecting trade and climate that are quite practical, speak to the context, and then trying to understand or distill some key lessons. The last point on that, and I think this is thinking about the implications for the international trade regime. I think first we should shift from the discourse on trade rules to using phrases like commercial diplomacy. The reason is because trade rules are very depoliticized. Put away the politics, but that's in a world where multilateralism was a key thing. The trading system, multilateral trading system, as we know, is kind of the rules-based trading system as part of the rule-based international order. But we all agree it's changing. The global order is changing very rapidly. And geopolitics is at the core. Diplomacy is now a huge kind of a factor driving force of trade policy. I think there's an opportunity there to think about, for example, how can commercial diplomacy be connected with just transition? That changes the kind of thinking from a more depoliticized sense to putting politics at the core of it, but also asking in terms of agency, what can diplomacy do? That creates a lot of opportunities for especially policymakers. The penultimate point that I'd like to make is also thinking about cross-regional learning, especially in the South-South sense. If you look at institutions that people don't talk much about, like BRICS, this is the South-South bloc. And if you think about it, the way they talk about climate change is through the lens of just development. And there you can see there's some connections of addressing developmental issues, at least the way they're thought in the global South, and kind of be thinking about how trade can bridge that gap between climate and developmental issues. I think I'll leave my comments there, but I think there are some opportunities or rather developments in the African continent that are not just important for Africa, but they could be lessons for everyone else or other places, of course, being contextualized, but also as the global order is shifting, I think we should pay attention to other kind of institutional arrangements like BRICS, G7 as well. They speak in a more contextual way to issues that speak industrialized countries, CBAM, etc. And so this diversity of institutions is absolutely important, and we should pay attention and maybe welcome that diversity of approaches to how we connect trade and climate. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kennedy. So it's very good to hear this kind of emphasis on the kind of institutional, the kind of innovations and the changes that are taking place. So you're absolutely right to highlight those. So I'd now like to turn to Laura Kelly from IIED, and Laura has been our partner for kind of a number of years as we've been providing different types of support and focusing on issues at the climate trade nexus. So Laura, perhaps if you'd like to follow on from some of the points that Kennedy made in relation to the kind of more bottom-up sort of approaches, the institutional innovations, and perhaps provide your views and your perspectives on the specific policy recommendations that you hear coming from the LDC group of negotiators in particular across the climate and trade nexus. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jodie. Welcome everyone to this really interesting session. Obviously, some of us are some are in Belém, some are here in London and around the world. And I think that to bring this group of people together to talk about these issues is a really useful forum, because as several other speakers have said, a lot of these discussions are very siloed. We need to have different approaches. Kennedy was just talking about commercial diplomacy, but also at the national level, bringing the themes together. So for those of you who perhaps don't know, IIED is a policy research organisation. We work a lot on climate, natural resources, sustainable markets, but we have a very strong focus on locally led approaches and bottom-up solutions to major global challenges in the climate, nature and development space. A lot of what we've already heard is very pertinent for LDCs, but there is the special situation of LDCs that we need to take on board. 32 of the 44 LDCs are in Africa, so it is also a particularly strong overlap with issues within the continent. What are some of the special characteristics or special challenges that the LDCs face? These are well documented and well known in the trade negotiations. Special and differential treatment and the recognition of LDCs as a distinct category has been there since the establishment of the WTO. Within the climate negotiations, there's also a set of special and differential treatments that actually, how does this really get addressed in practice? Because the LDCs are a relatively small grouping, relatively limited voice. They work together, for example, in the climate negotiations with the small island developing states, so that they often, work in coalitions to get their concerns and issues heard. Jodie referred to work that we've been doing jointly, and some of the things that have come up in that. We're going to be publishing a paper shortly, so I'll share some reflections from that. I think in terms of the characteristics of LDCs that are particularly relevant here, the lack of diversified economies. We've been hearing about need for green transition, the need for value add processing in country and the opportunities around that. The natural resource dependency of many LDCs mean that the regulations that we were talking about, the EUDR, or potentially even new UK forest risk commodity regulations coming in, there's a disproportionate impact on LDCs in that sense. And I think, Michael, you said you're at the DRC pavilion to participate in this discussion. Obviously, DRC is the home to about 80% of the world's cobalt reserves, really key for transition technologies and digital technologies. Around about 20% of that cobalt in the DRC comes from small scale and artisanal mines. So actually the role of small and local producers is really key, and really key in terms of overall economic development in these countries. Second area is that very often they lack access to private finance. There's been a lot of discussion about declining aid volumes, the role of the commitments for both aid for trade and climate finance being met increasingly from leveraging private sector finance. But LDCs are often excluded from these markets because the credit rating agencies sort of justify or specify their risks as too high. And we know that this is also an issue for many African countries, and the Africa risk premium is often talked about. So how do countries overcome some of these challenges? And then the sort of third area is around the priorities that the LDCs have often don't make the overall priority list. So the Brazil and now Brazil-Australia integrated forum on climate change and trade initiative that Caroline mentioned earlier, that's a really positive step in terms of trying to make the link between the trade and climate issues. But the areas that have been sort of set out as the priorities to look at in the first place actually often don't necessarily overlap with the priorities that the LDCs themselves have. So they also need to sort of find their voice, or to have their concerns registered in these more broad international Global South initiatives. So in terms of some of the initial thoughts that we've pulled together from the work that we've been doing with ODI, what are some of the key things that your policy recommendations for the LDCs? On the finance side, there's I think we're seeing some positive movement at COP around some sources of finance, but it's not just the quantity of finance, it's the quality of finance. Discussion around country platforms and locally led approaches really need to be at the centre of ensuring that finance gets to lower income countries in ways that they can use. And IID is involved in an initiative supporting the LDCs. It's called the Life AR initiative, which is taking the locally led action principles and really trying to implement that at the local level. It's working with a pool of donors, including the UK, the Irish, the Dutch. And that's a real opportunity to show how country platforms can integrate climate, nature, development finance at the local level and really help to address the challenges, but also to support some of the sort of the green technology and opportunity development that we've been hearing about. And that technology, obviously, there's a lot of local and indigenous technologies that are really important, but also we've heard from Ambassador Mohammed, for example, that a lot of those technologies need to be transferred. They need to be transferred more easily. They need to be transferred in affordable ways. The UNFCCC has a technology mechanism for developing countries. We really need to ensure that that's aligned with the WTO mechanisms around IP and trade-related technical assistance. Otherwise, it just becomes more hoops for LDC countries to jump through. And then the area of standards, yes, other speakers have touched quite a lot on that. Carbon market standards. Article 6 within UNFCCC is an opportunity to sort of arrange discussion or to sort of ensure that there is fair and equitable treatment with new proposals around these sort of standards. And I think we're also seeing the pause to the EU DR regulation came as much from businesses saying that they would find it difficult to comply because many producers at the end of their supply chains in tropical commodities like coffee and cocoa, for example, they just don't have the technology to enable them to demonstrate that they're complying. The technologies are available, geolocation, etc., but those technologies really need to be accessible to the countries and the producers themselves. So that's a couple of key areas that are important for LDCs and some of the sort of recommendations for ensuring that those concerns are heard and the support that they need is forthcoming to address this climate trade development nexus. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Laura. So very comprehensive intervention there. So I've just asked the audience if they can please put their questions in the chat. And I think in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll just pick up on a couple of the questions that we have so far. And I'll circle back to perhaps Ambassador Amina, if you have any initial reactions or thoughts, and then pass to each panelist if you have any initial reactions or thoughts. So we've got the question about the food security and climate change, and this point about the kind of transboundary climate risks that are arising in relation to food security and nutrition. And then we have this other second comment about the kind of geoeconomics, the geopolitical climate, demographic trends, and the kind of, growing South-South trade, and how can countries really diversify their markets and see this more as an opportunity as well. So I don't know, Ambassador Amina, if you had any initial reactions. I know you weren't expecting me to call on you, but just while you're with us, kind of any immediate reactions that come to you, and then I'll pass to Carolyn, Michael, Kennedy, and Laura, and then we'll wrap up and close because we're a bit short of time as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jody. Let me just say this: that first of all, extremely interesting, obviously, discussion, across the board. I think everybody has put on the table issues that are critically important, but also in turn raise, additional, questions on how to deal with them and things like that. What I found really interesting was what Michael Jacobs said about this conversation that was going to take place between the EU and other countries, developing countries, I'm hoping, on CBAM and other measures that have been put in place. I think that's extremely important because, as you know, it was a very a unilateral measure, if you take the EU as one, right, that was actually imposed without any consideration at what anybody else thought. And at some point, I remember, some countries that were having a conversation and they said, look, I think joining this, the whole climate conversation is becoming a big issue for us. Because with the climate conversation and our participation in it, more restrictions are being placed, on trade, and areas where we didn't have many restrictions and we actually had concessions provided are being rolled back. So we're seeing a rollback of the concessions that we enjoyed before. So I think having the conversation extremely interesting. I think it would be really important to see what comes out of this this conversation. I think the other issue that came up, which I also think is important, is the lack of cross-cutting, if you like, capabilities and capacities at negotiations, at climate negotiations, right? And I remember this was one of the issues that I posed a while back, that you really can't talk about climate with just a Minister of Environment. Because as soon as you touch climate, you're talking agriculture, you're talking energy transformation and energy efficiency. You're talking about industrialization, for instance, the policies that I mentioned when I started off. So there's so many cross-cutting issues here that these conversations cannot just be held in silos, if you like, right? And so it would be really important to, even if the climate conversation would happen just between the ministers of the environment and natural resources, but I think that would be very interesting to encourage these ministries to have these conversations before they go for this meeting, so that they actually understand what impact some of the measures that are being put in place would have on their own portfolios, on the area. Agriculture has been talked about. I have not seen a Minister of Agriculture attending climate discussions, and yet, honestly, they feel, I think, the biggest impact, right? And so it's important that happens. I really enjoyed listening also to everybody, but also to Ken and what he said, about the energy transition and the risks and the opportunities that are available. So all in all, I think that it's really interesting. I don't want to kind of take the last minutes that are left and dominate the conversation, but I think that the whole issue around commercial diplomacy with climate, I think it's very interesting. But I also know this because I think all of you know me as a trade negotiator. And so multilateral trade rules are extremely important to me. And so I don't think that you can rule that out as yet. And I don't think that you can actually have commercial diplomacy without relying on the trade rules, even those that exist already, if you're not thinking about the new ones that are coming up. And so I think you cannot divorce all these issues that we're discussing, and that's why this nexus is so important, the nexus between trade and climate. I don't think you can divorce the trade rules from the climate discussions that we're having. The avenue to use, obviously commercial diplomacy is a great avenue to use to have these conversations. But I'm gonna stop there because I could continue for much longer than you intended for me to speak, Jody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We hope to keep the conversation going as well, I think. So thank you so much indeed. And perhaps, Carolyn, you're able to perhaps pick up on these points as well, because I think this is exactly what you and your team are also trying to tackle, right? Is to kind of break down these silos and open up the discussion. So if you would like to provide your final reflections, also perhaps address one of the questions as well, that would be extremely helpful.
Thank you very much, Jody. Yep, fascinating discussion. So I really appreciated Kennedy's point around the importance of sort of national strategies and experiences grounded in national and regional realities, including on climate and trade. And here, I guess, I think it's just so important in terms of sort of governance innovations to emphasize the importance of sort of interministerial coordination at the national level in countries that brings together sort of climate, environment, natural resource, trade, agriculture, put this together. Now, I know that's not easy, but we can't, it's silly to talk about trade policy in isolation from climate related policies or in isolation from development policies. So this, I think, needs to be key. And then that needs to inform, the commercial diplomacy or the diplomatic engagement of countries at the international level. The only thing that I would say as a word of caution, I see that there's a lot of talk at the moment about putting trade into national adaptation plans, NDCs, all this national. And of course, it's critical to have a sense of what your national strategy is, but it's always in the context of a wider regional strategy or set of trading relationships. So, if you're involved in cross-border supply chains, so what we need to be thinking about is what kind of international cooperation on trade will enable countries to pursue their trade, climate, development sort of strategies. So I fear we end up further fragmenting by seeing these trade discussions in isolation in different domestic contexts. And I think, there are some, perhaps I'm not, as deeply embedded as many of you in the climate context, perhaps there are some climate strategies that really can be truly national, but a climate and trade strategy can never be purely national. It's by definition about your relationship with others. So I think that's a key thing to think harder about those national and regional strategies and the interface of your policies with those of your and regulations with those of your immediate neighbors and neighbors, trading partners further afield. And then just in terms of rules, I hear what Amina is saying. We think about this a lot at TESS because a lot of organizations and stakeholders are very skeptical about the capacity, for example, for the multilateral trading system to deliver new rules or update its rules right now. I think we need to see the multilateral setting as a critical part of the wider diplomatic kind of ecosystem around trade and climate. It's a critical place for information sharing, for generating ideas. We can generate soft law outcomes, guidance, recommendations, and understanding that shape how rules are understood. It can also generate a push towards longer term change in rules or could inform work at the regional, bilateral, other levels around rules. So we need to see it in sort of a dynamic context. I hope that helps, Jody.
Yes, I think that's come across very clearly. The dynamic context, also taking into account the kind of spillover effects and so on. So I think you're precisely right. It's almost like a kind of new type of surveillance as well. So Michael, I'd like to pass over to you for your final thoughts and reflections as well. So you've seen some questions in the chat box. You may want to pick up on those, or also what other speakers have said. Again, we've kind of got our eye on, what can we take forward, or what do you feel is most relevant to be taken forward into MC14 as well, coming up in March next year.
So can I pick up the question from Maria Obugo in the chat, or the comment, which I think is entirely legitimate, in the chat about African unity and collective action? I mean, it's really not for me to say as a European how Africa should organize itself, but as an observer, I think this is a really important point. I was at part of the IMO meeting in London, which was one of the most shocking meetings I've ever been to, in which individual nation states who came with a position in favor of a climate emissions regime for the shipping industry, expecting it to be ratified by a very large majority. Individual countries negotiated on their own and were bullied individually in an absolutely appalling way by the American delegates. Not just as national delegates, where they were told that they would have tariffs imposed on their countries, but as individuals, they were told that they wouldn't get visas to the US. And the point that Maria makes, which is that it's very hard for countries on their own to stand up to tactics like those. But in general, it's very hard for individual African countries to engage, I mean, not least with the EU, which is a collective of countries, does seem to be very important. And I have to say, I'm so glad, Amina, that you're still with us. Thank you very much for, on behalf of ODI Global, thank you very much for still being with us. Amina has been working, if I may say this, on another African collective initiative, which is, or in fact a global initiative, but which will have, I hope, very strong representation from Africa, which is a borrowers club. So at the Financing for Development conference in Seville in June, July, it was agreed by all nations, including creditors, that there really needs to be a stronger developing country voice for those countries that were primarily borrowers. This is obviously particularly important for African countries. And so Amina has been working very hard with the UN Secretary General's debt envoy, Mahmoud Mohideen, and with countries led by two African countries, Egypt and Zambia, to try and get a better collective structure forum for borrower countries. There is obviously the Africa Free Trade kind of discussions and regimes going on. We do have the African Union, but I have to say, as an observer, it's insufficiently resourced to do all the things that's being asked of it and so on. So I do think this is really critical, that the more Africa can collectivize in these issues and have collective strategies as well as individual national ones, I think the stronger for everybody. And we will see this in the Africa-EU relationships, where EU comes as one as well as 27. So that would be my offering for this. Although, as I hasten to add, this is really not my position to say what Africa should do.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael. So it's really helpful to hear also about the recent discussions at the IMO and the challenges there, and just more generally the kind of, like-minded countries that share the same objectives to really come together to tackle these issues. So Kennedy, would you like to pick up on any of the questions in the chat? Anything that struck up? We've also had a couple more questions on the kind of recent ICJ ruling, and there's another question as well about the kind of territorial emissions and so on. Are you still with us, Ken?
Yes, I am. And maybe I'll kind of take a bit of a broader approach and have my starting point from Ambassador Mohammed's point about diplomacy and rules. We view diplomats, or at least I view diplomats, as miracle workers, because we always call them in when we can't see a way through, and they always work miracles by, coming up with really creative ideas. And I think maybe that's a very interesting point that Ambassador you raised, and kind of suggests maybe we need to discuss more the connection between diplomacy and rules, and the kind of rules that work and rules that maybe need to be reworked, or new rules that we need. And I think that kind of connects the issue of, agency and through diplomats and structure as well. But I think just to tie it all together, and it's very refreshing to hear kind of very creative ideas on how to move the dial from this discussion and elsewhere. But I think there are three key things that come to my mind. One is experimentation. It seems there are quite a number of experiments, whether it's at the policy level or institutional level, that we're seeing in different places. I think we should maybe document that more and have a clearer picture of those kinds of experiments. I think there's a question of innovation as well, because over the last couple of years, we've seen kind of trade policy being used very creatively to advance our climate objectives. I think that's absolutely important as well. And lastly, I think it's a question of coordination that's coming up. And here is where, how do we kind of connect all these dots for all these interesting initiatives that are happening in different places, but also make sure that we're learning from each other as well, especially across regions, whether it's global north, global south, or between the global south as well. I think there are numerous opportunities. So I think the key word that like really take away, at least for me, what I take away is number one, maybe having a deeper conversation about diplomacy and rules, and especially trade rules, but also how kind of experimentation, innovation, and coordination maybe can provide opportunities for strengthening the links between trade and climate regimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ken. So over to you, Laura, for your final thoughts as well. We've heard a lot now about the kind of different institutional innovations, and I know you kind of highlighted some of the developments there with country platforms, but then we also heard from Carolyn about some of the risks of being kind of very nationally focused when you've got lots of developments at the regional and international level. So quite tricky to challenge. But is there anything there that you'd like to provide a final reflection on? Thanks.
Yeah, I think this question that's just come into the chat around the sort of extraterritorial emissions and the sort of carbon footprint, if you like, that many wealthier importing countries have. And I think what is needed there is, as we've been talking about, a greening of production, and that's going to require finance, and it's going to require some technology transfer. So I think that's the way to go down, to address those issues. It's not to sort of try to put further policy barriers in place. It's actually what can you do about it practically. But we do need to be wary of too great a focus on that, because that then further diverts resources into countries that are already producing using dirtier energy, so that you end up in the wealthier countries. And again, the LDCs tend to lose out. But I'll perhaps finish by sharing some information about one of the initiatives that I mentioned, the Life AR. I put it into the chat. That really is trying to do some of the things that Carolyn talked about, and Ambassador Mohammed, about getting governments at the national level to come together across the different ministries to have an integrated approach to their climate, trade and development policies and implementation, and also encouraging them, at least at the LDC group level, to share experience around that. And obviously that's not an exact geographical fit, but as I said earlier, 33 of the 44 LDCs are in Africa, so it's a good place to start. And many of the LDCs that are engaged in Life AR are from Africa. So it's been great to have this discussion, and I think this is some of the sort of concrete ways forward, and hopefully perhaps Patrick can pick up on that in his final reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's also something that's been very much on my mind as well. We have the kind of next Global Aid for Trade review coming up next year as well, after MC14. So Patrick, if it's okay, we'd just like to pass to you just for your kind of final reflections. Obviously, it's been a really rich and engaging discussion. I think we've got some key takeaways to reflect on as we look ahead to MC14. And obviously, you're from Trade Negotiations Investment Forum. You're our partner for organising this discussion. So over to you for your final thoughts, and then we'll close the webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Jodie. I shall be Jodie. Thanks for this. I think it's been a very good, interesting discussion. I always go back to my obsession with adaptation that just doesn't get enough attention. Why is it in everybody's interest? There are lots of reasons why it's in everybody's interest that it's given due attention. What does it actually mean? What's involved? And you know, this other side of the coin, mitigation. It's not. It's a fact that fossil fuels and agriculture are the most subsidized sectors in the world economy, mostly by rich countries. So, you know, there's some work to be done there, I would have thought. I think from the African point of view, it's really interesting to see two processes going on. And it's a great opportunity, but it's also a huge challenge. I mean, there isn't anything as ambitious as the ACS2 that's ever been tried with so many countries, and it's going to take quite a while. So I think that plus working out what cooperation can take place within the continent and how the continent should position itself with respect to the rest of the world on these climate issues, bearing in mind that there is a small fraction of CO2 emissions that come from the continent at this stage. But there's a great opportunity to go green from the outset. We're not spend too much time worrying about what is actually emitted today. And then I think I really do like Ken's point. You know, the WTO is premised on the assumption that all rules, that everyone goes to the same rules. It may take a little bit more time, but essentially it's convergence on the rules side. Trade liberalization, trade tariffs, and all that. Everyone has their whatever it is that matters to them. That is sort of somewhere outlying somewhere. So I think we should let's look at the trade rules again and thinking in terms of what options there are for cooperation that doesn't necessarily, which can but should not necessarily goes to formal legal resolution. I could go on, but I think probably there's enough has been said by enough people, and I shall stop. Thanks very much, Jodie, for that.
Thanks so much, Patrick, and thank you so much, Ambassador, all of our panelists, esteemed panelists, for joining us here today. So it seems that there is room for optimism. There's kind of new spaces for new dialogue between like-minded countries to tackle these issues, a kind of new willingness by some of the big players. Obviously, this is coming at a time when you've got a retreat from some of the other big players from the framework of rules. But I do see this kind of sense of optimism coming through, but very strongly this kind of need for more coordinated approaches, learning, thinking about institutional innovations and so on. So we'll reflect on the discussion as we continue our work stream, looking at kind of trade, climate, and looking ahead to MC14 as well. And I hope to keep you all engaged, and would just like to extend, you know, our sincere thanks and appreciation to you all for joining us here. And I hope that the audience has enjoyed this discussion as well. So hope to remain in touch with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.